Mm.
Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have had to discontinue our in-person events that generated revenue for us. And without that, we now depend on you for donations. So if you can, please send us a donation by going to our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Any amount will be welcome. Today's program is the culmination of our month-long celebration of Black History Month. And we are fortunate to have with us today Lewis Gordon, who has just come out with a new book, Fear of Black Consciousness, which he will be talking about today. He is chair of the philosophy department at the University of Connecticut Storrs and honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies, as well as visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, and honorary professor in the Unit for the Humanities at Rhodes University, South Africa. He co-edits the journal Philosophy and Global Affairs and the Rowman and Littlefield book series, Global Critical Caribbean Thought. He's obviously a very busy man, and is this week, he was just telling me, scheduled to speak in 3 other webinars. So we're fortunate that he was able to find time to be with us today. So let's give the floor to Lewis and some of his friends who are waving to him, like Karsten Struhl and Richard Jones, Ann Ferguson, and Fred Pincus, and Bob Stone, all coming on, and you'll have a chance to have a discussion with him after his presentation. But now let me give the floor to Lewis.
Well, thank you, Cliff. I open with Buenos Dias, Wunikisuk. If you're wondering what language that is, that's Wampanoag. As you know, the Wampanoag people are the ones who greeted the pilgrims, treated them with kindness, and unfortunately, the kindness wasn't returned. Vanakam, Dia Duit. Vanakam, some of you may not know that part of my ancestry is Tamil, and that's how you say, hello or good day. And Dia Duit, some of you may not know that part of my ancestry is Irish, and I could actually read Gaelic and Irish. And shalom, because some of you know I'm Jewish, and assalamu alaikum. But beyond all that, some of you also know I was born in Jamaica, so I hope you all keeping well. So I got to say, it's really wonderful to see all of you. Cliff, it was so great to see you. It is great to see you. I was saying to Cliff, I can't believe that Cliff is in his 80s. You look great, man. And Harry, it's so wonderful to see you. Richard, also to see Betsy and Bob and Anne and Karsten. Thank you. It's so great to see all of you. Okay. So one of the things, of course, is you're all really exemplars of what intellectuals and professors are about. And what I mean by that is, whenever I teach classes, I always teach classes with a conversation of what a professor is and what students are. And it's funny, students always think professors are like Moses with the tablets. So they think we come in and we offer it. And I usually point out to them that I regard a professor or an intellectual as someone who fell in love with learning and never lost it, just continue learning. And in fact, our research, the things we write, are basically us being students. And the fact that you're here, all of you who are esteemed professors, emeriti in some cases, it's about your continued love for learning. And that means we learn together. Indeed, what students usually realize is, although in some cases they're just coming to the table or just beginning to learn, they bring their experiences. And we don't always have the same experiences, which means there could be a different orientation, a different angle through which, and I know all of you would attest to this, even if you teach a course you've always taught, even if it's a course you teach every year, every time you're learning something from your students. And that's part of the joy. So thank you all for being here. And also, it's a very special thing for me because, as you know, I've been with the Radical Philosophy Association since I was a proverbial pup. Similarly with Sophia, right? From fall 1993. So it's great to see a lot of you. Okay, so the topic today is Black consciousness, political realities. And it's interesting. The book, as you may notice, is called Fear of Black Consciousness. So I could just jump the gun and get straight to the point of what fear of Black consciousness is. And fear of Black consciousness is a fear of truth and reality. The fact of the matter is, if you're going to build colonialism, racism, enslavement, and all these forms of degradation, misogyny, go down the list. You can do it through just using brute force, true, but brute force is not sustainable. What you need to do is to construct a whole edifice of lies about the people who are being dominated. And it's not sufficient for you simply to construct those lies for yourself. You need to find a way to get those people to believe those lies. So in effect, then, at the heart of colonialism, at the heart of racism, at the heart of misogyny, and we can go down the list, at the heart of all of them is a set of lies. And we have to remember that, because you see, sometimes when we're fighting struggles for liberation, to change the world, to make the world better, all will be lost if what we are doing is a lie. I mean, if it were really true, all these misrepresentations of us, if they turn out to be accurate, then we're on the wrong side. So in effect, although there's some people who may decry the importance of doing the intellectual work, decry the importance of exposing the truth, etc., it's a crucial part of our struggle. Because you see, if freedom is more than a value, freedom is more than a good, freedom also has to be a truth. And as we understand this, then it means then that to keep us away from that truth, there has to be the constant bullying, misrepresentation, etc., of lies. And those lies, as you know, throughout my career, I've referred to as la mauvaise foi, as bad faith. And one of the things about bad faith, a lot of, there's a way in which there's a real worry about bad faith. It's similar to the fears people have of psychoanalysis, and they're connected to the same problem, which is a form of narcissistic rage, because the whole point of the unconscious, subconscious, the whole point of regimes of lies is ultimately they are afraid of the truth. And this is one of the reasons why the response is often violent, is often of rage. It's often, bellicose. We see this right now, for instance, with the technique that's used in lawfare in the United States, but it's also used in countries of Europe, of picking any subject. You could pick any subject whatsoever. And if you respond to the subject with rage and all kinds of self-righteous moralism, you can actually have people believing things that are false. We see this right now with the attack on critical race theory in the United States. But if you look at it, most of the people who are fighting against it and argue against it have never even read anything about it. They don't even know what it is. And sometimes when I've spoken with reporters, I said, you could demonize anything. For instance, imagine this sentence. Could you believe they're teaching our children mathematics? And, for a second, somebody was like, oh my God, what are they doing? But there was a time where people complained about that. You already know about the history of, could you believe our children are being taught evolution? Could you believe our children are being taught science? Which is funny as they do this, because if you go to any elementary school right now, boy, what children are teaching each other would make your the hair rise on your back. You know what I mean? I remember when my children were in elementary school, and they, and I wasn't objecting to this. It just struck me as unusual that, they're kids in like the third grade, the second grade, trying to figure out their sexuality. This is the world we live in. And it's just a fact, Maybe they should listen to their children. Maybe they should take my counsel about what it is to be a professor and start learning some stuff from their children. They'll find out their children know a lot more about the world they're living in than they realize. But anyway, part of this thing is, now you could imagine, so this fear, what is this fear? Well, you see, this fear has many layers. One problem with the way we tend to talk about political issues, philosophical issues, and issues that pertain to the human condition is we tend to make the mistake of trying to address these issues in a singular one shoe size fits all model. But the reality is that's not how we live. Every one of us right now is the integration of many ways to look at the world. We do it through our books, as you see behind Karsten and me. But we also do it through our records, through our films, through our conversations in coffee shops and bars. We do it through our travels. We do it through our intimate relationships and our casual relationships. And if we're going to talk about these, we need to talk about them with the complexity and richness of what's involved in being a human being. And this is precisely because, as Frantz Fanon pointed out, that ultimately, oppression is a crime against humanity. The whole point of oppression is to identify human beings and then deny their humanity. It's to degrade them. It's to limit the extent to which they could act and make a difference in their lives. And I've already, in other places, talked about, for instance, the fact that anti-Black racism, as an example, is a form of bad faith precisely because it involves identifying Blacks who are human beings and then deny they're human beings. But the whole point about that language is, of course, there are things we do, human beings, among each other, that makes it very clear that the complexity of this lie requires a lie to the self, to make the self believe what the self ultimately doesn't believe. And so in this book, I do a variety of things, but among them is what I do is challenge the discursive or the mechanisms by which we talk about these issues. Unfortunately, when it comes to intellectual work, part of the colonization process is to make us think that to think as intellectuals, we must write as though we're writing government manuals. And it's really striking how that mode of presentation has affected the way ideas are transmitted to the point where there is a form of disdain to the everyday person's capacity to think and understand. And so you may notice, those of you who have looked at the book, that I draw upon resources of allegory, metaphors, and a varieties of ways in which people actually think and live. Now, that is to introduce how I talk about the notion of fear. But the way I talk about the notion of Black is manifold. And one of the things right now that we often hear when we talk about racism and sexism is that we talk about constructivity. We talk about social constructivity. But one problem is that many people who talk about social constructivity don't elaborate. They don't tell a story. They don't narrate the ways in which people are constructed. And the ways in which people are constructed is linked to a very important element that's often elided in the hegemonic liberal discourses. And what that is power. A big problem with liberal political theory, liberal organized theory, is that it tends to moralize issues in such a way and individualizes issues in such a way that you would think that individual human beings are gods who can just change the world by adjusting their moral dispositions. But what's not addressed is the complexity of power. And power, as I use it in my discussion, is basically the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. And so we must ask, what are the conditions? Well, if we think about my body, myself is located here, then all power is, my abilities are within my physical reach, my ability to pick up this cup and drink from it. However, because I live in a world disclosed by human beings, there are language, signs, symbols, technologies, rules, all kinds of things that enable me to be here in West Hartford, Connecticut, while I'm speaking to many of you who are in different parts of the world. You could be in Mexico, you could be in another part of the United States. In some of my presentations, there are people in Japan, there are people in Senegal. And that means that we, through the building of this human reality, which Freud called a prosthetic God, we are able to have an impact on the world beyond our physical location. And this is the social dimension, the relational dimension of power. Now, as we know, people can use that ability to block other people's abilities. And that's the coercive use of power. That is a conception of power that has been inherited from the Hobbesian model. And it's something that goes hand in hand with what emerged in the Euro-modern world with capitalism and with other mechanisms as well. It's not only, in other words, we need to get away from just talking about one element as if it causes everything. The human world is converging multiple elements. And so if we look at something like the history of, say, race, what many people don't realize is that race started off as a theological naturalistic concept. In the Euro-modern world, we tend to contrast naturalism with theology. And that's a fallacy, because all there is from a theological framework that is natural is that which emanates from God. If you're outside of the eyes of God, you're not natural. And this is crucial because in what we now call the Middle Ages, but at that time it was actually its own form of modern age, when the Afro-Muslim populations reached into the Iberian Peninsula and were heading into France and beyond, they were presenting a different view of the world. And through a varieties of miscalculation, the rest of what we call Europe didn't become Muslim. And as a consequence, the history we have is one from Latin and Germanic languages. But in Andalusia, in the Iberian area, there were Jews and Afro-Muslims. And as you know, there were Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews, and pretty much Jews who look like me. And the term that was used for them was reza. The Spanish pronunciation today say raza, but it was reza. And reza came from re, which is from Arabic to refer to originating from the East. And its terms go all the way back to antiquity, to the language of Meduneter, where Re was also the name of the sun god. So you could see what it is to rise in the East and set in the West. However, within the Christian framework, where to be legitimate is to be in the eyes of a Christian God, Jews and Moors were put under the designation Reza, and that was put alongside horses and dogs. And I talk a lot, not only in this book, but other places, about what is going on there. Because a lot of people don't realize the complex history of associating horses, donkeys, and dogs with labor, okay, with creatures of burden. And so this tagging on to those populations led to a situation, as we know, in which there were also efforts of forced conversion. Because after 800 years of Afro-Muslim rule, after a while, you can't tell the difference morphologically between some of the Southern Europeans and some of the West Asians and Africans who were walking around in that area. And so this began to lead to an effort to draw it out of the people. Now, to cut the story, to make the story move on a little quickly, the transition of this complex battle, particularly with Ferdinand and Isabel, which culminated in the Battle of Grenada in 1492, January 1492, and a new stage of the Inquisition in March 1492. As we know, Columbus landed in the Bahamas in October 1492. And suddenly, within that theo-naturalistic framework, there were people who were neither Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. Now you notice at this point, this kind of taxonomy is not talking really about color. But as this situation emerged of people who are outside of that framework, it stimulated a philosophical anthropological reflection. And that question became, what is the reza of these people if these people do not appear in the Bible? And also, what was happening was a shift in the economies of Christendom which became Europe. And that shift was ships with very modest means traveling across the ocean were returning with resources that were making people filthy rich. And this began to create all kinds of disruptions that began to now have a convergence of the logic of Christian theology in the form of theodicy, in which a certain group of people are rationalized as being within the ambit of the divine, and other people who are outside. And within that framework, all kinds of shifts and rationalizations began to occur. So for instance, if you look at some of the writings that preceded that period, the writings that brought in Aristotelianism, the fundamental point of differentiation was sex and was gender. And at first, a form of language of effeminization was there. But once Reza came in, it meant rethinking the designated females of Europe outside of the framework of undeveloped men and into the framework of fully developed whites. And this began to create a category. And the category, which we know as race, included the notion of a fundamental tag on what became known as negro, because it was Spanish and Portuguese, transformed by the French, because the French has a word for the color black. It's la noire. It's in the feminine. But the French, in order to specify a new kind of being, instead of saying noir, la noire, or le noir, said le nègre. In other words, they created a new word to deal with a new kind of being. And that new word was adopted by English-speaking populations, because as you know, in the English language, there is a word for black. It's called black. So why in the world did the word Negro enter English? And even more, Scottish English, I tell you, if you speak with a Scottish accent, their effort was to borrow the French word. And that's what led from le nègre to the pejorative word, as you all know in the English language, nigger. But that came through Scottish pronunciation of French. And so what we have is this new creation, the Negro. But the thing is, the people now who are being taken to bring labor, so to speak, and other resources to now the growing economies, these people were not in their home countries Negroes or Blacks. These people were Wolof, Yoruba, Igbo, Xhosa, Zulu. Well, Zulu came later, but you know, Ashanti. You could go through the long list, Luo, Kikoyo, all the way through. And one of the things, as these people were being kidnapped and brought over, they were being transformed into new kinds of beings. But one of the things I have to stress is this is where the ideological misrepresentation and disinformation begins. Because you see, there were always Blacks in Europe. There were always Blacks in Portugal, Spain, even in Elizabethan England. The census revealed in London, 10,000 people were Black. So that's not new. However, the misrepresentation of the humanity of the people began. And that misrepresentation has led to this day, people thinking of the enslaved peoples as brute labor. The stereotype of the African walking in the bush, snatched up, thrown into a ship, Middle Passage, and brought over began. But what I have to remind audiences is that those people were from African civilizations in which the population being stolen were skilled labor. They were farmers, physicians, lawyers, engineers. They were spiritual leaders. They were poets. There were people who were from midwives to all the way through to architects. And in fact, because a lot of people don't realize this, they don't realize that those skills were brought to what's called the New World. And a lot of those skills contributed to what is the prosperity of this country. In fact, the porch, just a thing like a porch, that's an African invention. I often say to my students, good God, what would your morning be like if you were to take Black people out of history? You know, Beecher, Reverend Beecher, the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, once remarked, if you took Black people out of history, what you would lose is nothing. And boy, was he wrong. The light from the filament of the light bulb, all the way through to the music we listen to, all the way through to the scientific techniques in agriculture, all the way to the toilet, to the doorknob, the list is long about what those skilled laborers brought. And although I'm focusing on Africans, it's not only Africans. As we know, the skilled labor of the indigenous populations here, the skilled labor of the variety of European servitudes, such as the Irish, the Welsh, those people brought their skill sets, and the misrepresentation of the histories of those people, that's part of this ideological framework. So already implicit in the way I'm talking about Black is we have to understand that it's connected to something relational. And part of what is being hidden in the misrepresentation of Blackness is to isolate it so much that we don't see the connection it has with discourses of empowerment versus disempowerment in discourses of freedom. So this Black created, this false Black, is a production of the Euromodern world. And to make matters worse, this Negro, and then subsequently called Black, is indigenous to that Euromodern world because the pre-colonial world had no reason to call them that. Those people had no reason to call themselves that. So this constructed world of Blacks creates a peculiar neurotic situation because the people are indigenous to that world, but then that world asserts that those people don't belong. So you could imagine a situation of being indigenous to a world that rejects you. It produces a form of melancholia that says you do not belong at all. And this is how it affects the conception of the modern. Because you see, to be modern is not actually to be European. There have been many moderns. To be modern, all modern is by virtue of being connected to where humanity is going, you retroactively legitimate your present. All the word modern means is to belong to the present. And so when we look at this Blackness, it occasions, and this is what I mean by lowercase b Black, it occasions a form of double consciousness. It's what W.B. Du Bois, but not only he, people like Antonia Femin in Haiti, people like Richard Wright, there are many others who talk about this double consciousness. And that is where you see yourself as constructed by those who reject you. So this is the kind of colonial, lowercase Black view. And this is not to deride people who have that consciousness. It's just to acknowledge that they live in a world that misrepresents them, that hides from them who they are. And if they come to believe it, that world constructs them as a problem. And you may notice in the book that I talk about some of these issues. I'm very critical, for instance, the way today people like to talk about Black bodies. They speak about Black bodies as if Black people are just things walking around. And there's a discourse that actually misrepresents even the truth about white people. And the truth about white people is that there's a lie that white people actually hate black bodies. That's one of the reasons why I talk about the movie Get Out, which is so really cool. Because the history actually shows, the history of this country shows that there's an awful lot of desire that a lot of white people have had for these black bodies and Native American bodies and brown bodies, etc. And there's an awful lot of desire that their black bodies and brown bodies have for other bodies. In short, part of the lie is to impose on us the notion of ontological difference that makes us lie about desire. The truth is that we're human beings, and human beings can see the beauty, the attributes in their fellow human beings. But I put it this way the other day in an interview. I had an interview in the UK that from a podcast that's called Let's Talk About Whiteness. And I asked the interviewer, I said, if a guy walks up and constantly says, I don't desire you, I really don't desire you, I don't like you at all, after a while, you're going to say, yo, I think you desire me. So if you think of all the chest beating and effort to claim that white people don't desire black people, I think it's pretty much the evidence that white people actually do. So this is the kind of bad faith that's there. But what Du Bois observed, and I'm using Du Bois because he's familiar to it, but there are others who have talked about this, is that, you see, this creates the notion of problem people. That ridiculous notion that black people don't belong to history, don't belong to time. That means then the problem of black people is that we exist. And this leads to a deeper problem. Let me start first with the simple problem. The simple problem is when a society makes a people into a problem. In doing so, it fails to address the problems that people face. When you understand people as human beings, you understand them as human beings facing problems, which enables you to deal with structural conditions, whether they be poverty, whether they be an unequal justice system, whether they be environmental hazards, etc. So that's where you understand people as people who face problems. But there is also a deeper problem in philosophical sense. Because you see, in order to construct a group of people who are above humanity, you have to make them into gods. But the human being, as we know, is not properly a thing or a being. The human being is a relationship and activities. In other words, the paradox of being a human being is you're born human, and then you spend the rest of your life becoming human. This is one of the insights of existential thought. Humanity is actually that which steps out of being. And one of the, I think, the best illustrations of this is the biblical story of Adam and Eve. A lot of people give Eve a bad rap, because, if God, the story is God said, don't eat from the tree, and, they eat from the tree of knowledge, and you already know the story. But a lot of people don't ask, first of all, the moment God says, don't eat from the tree, you all know this, those of you who have children, if you say, don't eat from the cookie jar, some cookies are going to go missing. And at that moment, what goes into your child's consciousness, which is, of course, what went into the consciousness of the allegory, the myth of Adam and Eve, is the realization of the human being as the capacity to disobey even the greatest metaphysical being. In other words, the ability to choose to obey or disobey is an expression of human freedom. So actually, in this interpretation, and interestingly enough, it's the Jewish interpretation. There are varieties of Jewish interpretation from Lilith to Eve, but in this interpretation, Eve is actually the heroine of the story. Because if that act of disobedience didn't occur, there will be no humanity. Humanity is that which steps out, is that which poses the possibility of freedom. So if you look at white supremacy as an effort to construct a notion of a group of beings that are complete, full, permanent. That is dehumanization. And so the problem that is raised in a philosophical sense of Blacks is precisely because Blacks exemplify non-being. But what that really means is a clue to human being. And if you look at all racisms, all of them, colonialisms, take the form of segregation to impose the Aristotelian logic of contraries onto human existence. And that's why you could have a universal white versus a universal non-white. But that's not how human beings live. Human reality is dialectical. At any moment, there's interaction, speech, communication, contradictions wage, and what we exemplify is the ongoing intimacy, in fact, and this is one of the fears of white supremacy, intimacy of language. With language, we're all inside each other in a shared world. So the lowercase b Black, the moment you realize that that is constructed to make not only Black people into problems, but to create a false conception of human relations, then you come now to say, yo, the problem is a society that makes people into problems. Let us change that society. And that's where you now raise uppercase B, Black consciousness. It is to become an agent of history. It's the realization that the project is not to become a thing, a being, but the project is to cultivate and develop social relations that are actually transformative and actually a conception of power that has within it the capacity to empower. Colonialism is the project of disempowering a group of people for the sake of constructing a false self-image of another group of people. Anti-colonialism, struggles for liberation, requires fighting against that disempowerment, which means empowering people through the richness of human social relations. And so that uppercase B, Black consciousness, you could see then how it's linked to projects such as democracy, equal opportunity under law, liberation, the list goes on. And that's why I argue, if we look at something like Black Lives Matter, that Black Lives Matter is not saying Black Lives Matter over other lives. It is saying so long as you live in a society that degrades Black life, that limits Black life's capacity to be citizens, to have access to the mechanisms of social power. In fact, one of the biggest fears in anti-Black societies is the conjunction of the word Black and power. But power here means social power, the ability to have an impact on the world. Then it means Black Lives Matter is really a struggle for democracy. And that's why there were so many whites who joined the Black Lives Matter struggle. So this leads then, once we understand this, to a variety of issues in which I take umbrage. And we could get in our conversation to look at some of them, but I'll just bring up one for now, and we can continue the conversation through the others. Because in the book, I really focus on this, but not on the book, throughout my career. And that is liberalism loves moralism. Liberalism loves the individualizing of issues in such a way that you treat yourself as a moralistic individual God. The problem is racism, sexism, and the varieties of other forms of dehumanization are political issues. I've never, ever been discriminated against as Lewis Gordon, except, of course, when members of my family are pissed at me. But when I've been discriminated against, either with the N-word, or when I faced anti-Semitism, or when I faced homophobia, or when I faced a long list of other issues, it's always been because of being identified as a member of a group. So you see the problem, right? Liberalism wants to say it will only recognize individual rights and individual persons. But the problem with it is that it's groups who are discriminated against. So how are you going to fight and empower a group if you can never see the group? You add to this the problem of neoconservatism and conservatism. Neoconservatism actually recognizes groups. It just says some groups are inferior. So it throws its racism out there. It also is obsessed around order and security, and it renders certain groups dangerous. And as we know, if you push conservatism enough into neoconservatism, it ultimately is antipathetic to difference. And so it so radicalizes sameness that it's no accident that neoconservatism eventually slides into fascism. But when we talk about leftism, one problem with liberalism is that because liberalism works in the logic of tolerance, its relationship to the right and conservatism is to tolerate those who see themselves at war with liberalism. So in fact, all the right has to do is say, sure, tolerate me while I try to destroy you. And as we know with leftism, there's anarchic leftism, but anarchic leftism sometimes collapses into a form of individualism that slides back into the very problem that these forms of oppression are trying to fight against. But there's another kind of leftism, a leftism premised upon political responsibility. And the leftism premised upon political responsibility, which you could see in a long list from people who think about this, from Iris Young, one of the people who was part of our group, all the people, or the people like Jaspers, all the way through. A lot of my writings culminate in political responsibility. But I also talk about it in terms of Frederick Douglass, Frantz Fanon, and others. So the issue I take umbrage with is this. Because liberalism fetishizes morality and tends to want to focus on moral persons, liberalism loves the language of privilege. And if you notice, this may surprise a lot of people, but I'm a critic of the language of white privilege. And one of the reasons I'm a critic of it is because what snuck into the language is to construct as white privilege things such as access to good housing, education, clean water, healthcare, fair and equal treatment under law. I could keep going through the list. And when you unpack it, these are rights. It's absurd to tell people to be guilty for those. What we should be saying is, why are those rights being blocked from other communities? The issue isn't that white people have those privileges. The issue is that they're being blocked from other groups of people. Everyone should have those. However, there is something nobody should have. And if you look at the history of white supremacy has a history of an exemption clause through which whites have been able to massacre groups of people, whether it's the destruction of Native Americans in the United States to the point of 96% of them being destroyed, whether it's lynchings of Blacks where people can pose in front of the victims, or we could look at the police killings, judicial killings or murder of Black people. When you can commit those acts in public and get away with them, that's not a privilege. This sentence, I have a privilege to murder you. I have the privilege of raping you. I have the privilege of stealing from you. Those are not privileges, but you can have a license to do that. And anybody who studies political philosophy knows the distinction between liberties and license. So the problem, I argue, is that there is a tacit license imposed upon whiteness. And if we can understand it as a license, then we can understand it as something that whites could say, I don't want to have. You can give up those licenses and fulfill your promise as a human being. And if you can give that up, it means you can work with those who don't have that license to ensure a world in which nobody has such a license. Nobody should have a license to kill. Nobody should have a license to rape, steal, and do all of the things that we've seen in the history of white supremacy. But here's the thing. You can get rid of white supremacy, but you could still have anti-Black racism. And some of you are in Latin America know this, that Latin America may have mestizo populations, it may have mixtures, but Latin American societies are vehemently anti-Black. The fundamental issue there is ultimately to be away from Blackness. And so if we're going to deal, what we have to do is disentangle white supremacy and anti-Black racism to understand that these are two different kinds of struggles to deal with, but both of them are linked to dehumanization. And so I close with a reflection. There's a lot that I talk about in the book, but I think this is a lot for now. But a reflection is, right now what's in vogue is Afro-pessimism. And white fetishism, white centrism, and liberalism love Afro-pessimism, because Afro-pessimism develops these absurdities of making a priori claims on the permanence of racism. I mean, a priori claims that somehow something historical, as I just pointed out, as the formation of anti-Black racism, it makes these claims of them being ontological, which is absolutely absurd. It also makes the claim that Black people are not human beings, that only whites are human beings. But as I just pointed out, the very construction of superiority in being is inhuman. And so the next part of it is this silly a priori notion about the future, when in fact anybody who does political action knows that political action is premised upon contingency. Political action is always about what you're going to do. And this raises an existential conundrum. Because when you act politically, you're acting without knowing the outcome before the performance. And when we think about it, sometimes I'm asked, who inspires you? And sometimes people want us to talk about those grandiose figures in history. But actually, the people who inspire me are those nameless people, those women and men against whom the odds seemed that their actions were meaningless, were impossible. And I talk about some of them in the book. They're the people like Harriet Bailey, Frederick Douglass's mother, because that woman's actions brought something into the life of an enslaved child. And that action was love. But the radicality of that love was his valuing the love of a woman whom a society says could not offer valuable love because she was a slave. And we think about the countless enslaved people, and not only Black enslaved people, but the countless people who stood up and fought against oppression, who remain nameless. But we know with absolute certainty that their actions were the conditions of possibility for those of us to come, for those of us who are able to fight a struggle in a different way, and for those of us to inherit today the responsibility of fighting for those to come, whom we also will never know and would also never know us. And that is the core of political action. The core of political action is the humility to understand that it's not about you. It's always about us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Louis. There's a lot to chew on there, and I'm sure that there are many of you who will have questions or comments. Let me first explain that those who are watching this on YouTube can get your questions to us by sending an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I'll pass your question on to Louis here in the Zoom room. Those who are in the Zoom room, of course, can raise your questions directly. And I invite you to do so by raising your hands or waving at me, and I'll call on you. So, who wishes to speak first?
I see something was in the chat.
Oh, okay. Well, I see Karsten right now has.
Go ahead, Karsten.
Yeah, that was great, Louis. You just put so much together in what, 45, 50 minutes. It was just amazing. I'm really impressed. I have one question, and it's kind of, it's not a question really meant as a challenge, but as really trying to understand what this can mean. So people are racialized. There are no races in actuality. And so we're going to understand that as Black, small, lowercase. But Black, uppercase, still has that feeling of racialization. And the force of your talk was that ultimately we have to undermine racialization, the social relations that create racialization. So how do you put that together?
Thanks, Karsten. That's a wonderful question. What I elaborate in the book is how we talk about political action and political thought. If you pick apartheid South Africa as an example, the state, because it was committed to addressing Blacks at all, it meant it had to repress also any kind of action or activity that would constitute speech. And in those actions, it meant anybody, in effect, who was addressing the state's effort to dehumanize certain members of the population, they became the enemy of the state. In a word, they became blackened. And that's why Biko, Mangani, and many others looked at Blackness as a political relationship to state power and to mechanisms in civil society that were uncivil. In other words, the notion of white civil society as a policing of the movement of interactions between Black and white people and others. And so that capital B is a political Blackness, but it's open. It doesn't take the position that it's permanent. It doesn't take the position that those to come may adhere to it. It actually takes the position that it's a condition of possibility for subsequent generations to have the freedom to live as they so choose and embody. And this is one of the reasons why in the book, some people may be surprised at how I address the transraciality issue. Because as we know, we have a variety of trans issues. And I said, why are we so worried about this? The truth is there have always been transracial people. One of the most transracial peoples are Jews. The island I'm from in Jamaica, my relatives, I never looked at them as white, Black, or whatever stuff. They're just my relatives. But it turns out the Jews I'm from, one set were from Shannon Island, the other set were from Jerusalem. But in Jamaica, because the national identity was Black, they were just Black people, even though their color range from you to Richard to me, etc. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. I have countless examples of people who moved into Black communities, were not trying to pass, but by virtue of how they interact with their community as fellow human beings, ended up having a legacy that was Black, because they were in a country that segregated people. And what struck me about these transracial discourses is a lot of people began to collapse into a kind of my oppression as property discourse. When oppression is something you're trying to get rid of, not something you want to fetishize and attach yourself to. And so, of course, there are opportunists out there, like the movie Soul Man, but the fact of the matter, that's something completely different. There are people in their lived reality, just like there are people who convert to religions in different communities, who actually are at home in those communities. And I don't see those as actually negative or threats. I see those as unmasking the contradictions of notions of racial purity. And I'm sure what I argue is that there are new identities to come. There may be, who says, and one of the things I argue against is, for instance, many societies think their Blacks are the Blacks, just like many societies think their Jews are the Jews, their Muslims are the Muslims. But the complexity of how people are globally is such that there are creative ways in which we continue to grow. And I see part of our political project is to find ways for people to be able to work and struggle together with true dignity, which means they shouldn't have to hide who they are. And they also should have room for mistakes. And by mistakes, what I mean is there are times all of us realize, this is part of learning, that we could always do better. And I see that as one of the insights of a true humanistic left-wing radical struggle. So yeah, so the capital B Black I see as is not a well-formed formula. It's in this context an open possibility that itself may be transcended.
Would it be accurate to say that Black, capital B, consciousness is a project to transcend Black consciousness?
I would say it's a project to transcend racism and all forms of dehumanization. And that's why I see it relationally. Conceptions of Black consciousness that say Black people work exclusively with Black people, I think that's part of the ossification. I've never supported that model. Conceptions of Black consciousness that collapse into notions that are ontological, don't defend that. But of course, I could give another metaphor here, or rather allegory. Remember when Audre Lorde said the master's tools don't tear down the master's house? And you could probably guess from my discussion of the African enslaved, my response is masters don't build houses. Enslaved people and workers do. So it would be a good idea to get together and start building other houses, better houses. And in the end, the so-called master's house loses its force of mastery. It becomes an irrelevant house. But this other house now, if it has better food, better music, better relations, etc., its architectural structure might be very different. And although we may call it a house, it may be something much more. And I see that as the creative task of our work. So it's not so much the question of getting rid of Blackness. It's about the question of trying to figure out what better or new relations we can have with others. Because, for instance, I argue that Blackness doesn't even make sense by itself. It is always engendered. It's always has a sexual orientation. It's always multiple religious and secular dimensions. It's always more. And that creative multidimensionality reaches a certain point where we may find that part of political struggle is also the production of new kinds of humanity. Yeah, Richard, I see your hands up. Thank you, Karsten.
Yes, hello, Brother Lewis. I just have a brief question. On this last day of Black History Month, I'm wondering how you feel that Black consciousness with a capital B, Black consciousness, should relate to the situation in Russia and Ukraine. In other words, to say it in another way, what dog do Black people have in this fight? Is it possible that the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Or should Black people take a different view from the propaganda that I'm hearing on CNN, MSNBC? And I'd like to conclude my question with a compliment that I'm greatly impressed by your eloquence, your humility, your kindness. And from the first time I met you, I continue to be a follower. And every time I hear you speak, I learn something. Every time I read something that you've written, I learn something, and you're part of my evolution as a Black man and a philosopher.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Richard. As you already know, each of you, many of you have in varieties of ways popped up in my work. And part of it is I'm not one of those people who believe in perfunctory acknowledgement of people. Okay, the best way is to learn from fellow intellectuals and to use their work. You know, there are a lot of people, for instance, who say they're feminists, but they don't cite women. That doesn't make any sense to me. I've never been able to do my work without citing women authors. It makes no sense. And same with our communities in East Asia, across Africa, etc. One of the complicated things we're dealing with, of course, we have to take very seriously that what's going on in terms of Putin was instrumental in putting Trump into power. And that the white supremacists in this country are to the point where they would rather embrace fascist and totalitarian forces than to share democracy at all with Black and brown peoples. And so one of the things we should take very seriously is that part of being Black, and not just Black, I'm just talking about anybody who's committed to building a better future, a decent world, is that we're fighting on multiple fronts. We're fighting both fascism at home and abroad. And we're fighting it under conditions that require genuine 21st century understandings. You know, it's striking to me that many people are trying to respond to 21st century problems with 19th century and 18th century models of the planet. But look, you know, especially, you know, what really struck me as someone who's gone around this planet so many times is we live on a really tiny planet. You know, when our little blue dot, as Carl Sagan said, if it's going to take us more than 24 hours to get somewhere, we're miffed. You know, when we're dealing with ideas where it used to take 3 years to get from one point to another. So the very fact that we can traverse space and time so quickly means space has shrunk. We're in a planet of 8 billion people, technological resources to destroy not all life. Life will continue without us, but destroy our life and a lot of species along the way. And one of the things we have to understand is that being wedded to models of the privatization of power, to be wedded to models that tries to set up global capitalism that ultimately collapse into oligarchies, that is not the way. Just as Black Lives Matter is a fight for democracy, I think the struggle is a fight for the global public access of power. If we get rid of nation states, if we get rid of these conditions that enable capital to produce vulnerability in different parts of the globe, if capital has nowhere to hide, then we don't have refugees, because people will just go anywhere on the planet without passports, without any of these things, with what suits them. We can't handle the environmental crisis with the nation state model. And so I think in this, what we are facing, we do have something at stake in what's happening, not only in the Ukraine, but also in Yemen. We also have it at stake in terms of what is going on in Ethiopia, Cameroon, and also all across the planet right now, also in Brazil. A lot of people are paying attention to these because what we're seeing right now is a reassertion of the right with the mantra of the privatization of power through distorting the understanding of what ultimately capitalism is about. And one of the things we need to do also is how we deal with these issues at the level of political economy. For instance, there are people who don't understand that capitalism is actually anti-markets. Capitalism is the elimination of the plural conception of markets through asserting the Theodician colonial conception of the market. And within that framework of the market, it ultimately commodifies everything because pluralistic markets are just too human. They're creative and they may not function according to the logic of profit. You see what I'm saying? There are different logics there. And so if we're going to deal with these issues, we have to bear in mind that we also have a deeper problem. And it's a problem that is still here. And that is that the people who are fighting for oligarchy are also people who are politically nihilistic. They're anti-politics because politics requires the actual communicative practices and distribution of power that constitutes citizenship. What oligarchs are fighting for, why I say it's nihilistic, is because if you look at them carefully, their logic is that their individual death is the end of the world. And that's a very dangerous mentality because it means then they have no investment in the future or the conditions of being a condition of possibility for those to come. And that is something we have to fight against. And by fighting against, it means we have to start the mechanisms on all fronts of the disempowering of oligarchs, of the disempowering of mechanisms that privatize power. And you could probably see where I'm going with this, because if you radicalize the publicity of power, you're a proponent of radical democracy. So we do have a stake in it, in other words. It has always been the case that Black people, whether it's in the Americas or in Africa or in Australia, because when I say Black people, I include Australian Koris, New Zealand Maoris, I include the untouchables of India, right? Black people for me are not really about melanin and, racial. Black people for me are a relationship to power in which there's been a construction of disempowering the humanity of people. So that's what I see Black people as about. Black people, and this is why I see many people who are not designated Black can join that struggle and in effect be blackened by fighting for the empowerment of humankind. Okay, I see Bob's hand is up. Yeah, and yeah, go ahead, Bob. Oh, you got to unmute. Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Louis. Hi, Richard. It's so neat to be together, and this moment is very special. In 1964, Sartre gave a lecture in Rome calling for what I will simply tell you, having studied it for 40 years, calling for what Lewis calls global public access to power. Uh, and night before last, in an interview with Paul Jay, Betsy's and my friend Sasha Buzgalin called for the same thing. He's a Russian economist. He's in the faculty at the University of Moscow, but he's a true commie. And he calls for what Sartre in that lecture described as integral humanity. And you can describe it negatively as a classless society, or positively as the empowering of the people of the world. Now has been, and even today sounds like, a totally utopian and impossible goal. But I think it, at least as a regulative idea, it allows us to prioritize and make selections among means to it that might bring it into being. I just wrote a note to Sasha, remembering a moment that we were together in Florence in November of 2002, right before the European Social Forum of that year, in which we tried to imagine, thinking we were on the cusp of history, that other world that we all thought at that time and place was possible, and which the mayor of Florence recognized and allowed Sasha to have the Piazza della Repubblica to put on a ad hoc street theater play of the history of the Russian Revolution, a very revisionist history, needless to say, one that I think many of us could identify with. I wanted to just say, from what I have studied in this so-called second ethics that Betsy and I have been working on for 40 years, you're talking about it. You're living it. Your words are describing it. And we're here in Mexico, where 80% of the population is La Raza. That means there's some color or other. 80% are some color or other. That's rather important. I like being here. I'm going to be a citizen. It has hope. And you give us hope too, Louis. Thank you. I just wanted to say that we're still working on our book. This albatross around our neck, it will be out. Its title is Integral Humanity. And it was possible in that moment between 62 and 64 and 65, up to 68. I think 68 was the end of the 60s, frankly. And the living heart of it was the anti-colonial victories in Algeria and in Cuba. And it allowed us to imagine and allowed Sartre to imagine what this insistently Sartrean emphasis on the positive definition of our goal, integral humanity, not just classless society. You might have a classless society or the semblance thereof without the realization of the agency of humanity. But we're so beaten down by the nuclear threat, we've allowed our leaders for 77 years to threaten and have us cowering under the obliteration.
See,
Extinction
muchas,
is not,
yeah,
I beg your
muchas,
pardon?
no, I'll say muchas gracias, mi amigo. Entiendo.
Okay, that's total.
So, yeah, that's not, and also,
Yeah,
no, but also Linton Kwesi Johnson says it well in his wonderful poem and song, Reality Poem, right? Because he ultimately says that, a lot of people miss the point, isn't it? I mean, a lot of things all of you who are here have done in your lives, what you realize that at the end of the day, you didn't know the outcome of your actions, but you knew your commitment. And one of the things I argue for is the existential political act of commitment. I give examples not only in the book, but also what we've just seen. There's so many things that people are always telling you are impossible. You know what some people say when you try to do something? It won't work. And you ask why, and they said, I tried it. Yeah, but who says the conditions under which you tried it are the same conditions under which people are trying it today? And so I found quite often what some people don't understand is how to analyze failure. Because you see, a system that believes you'll never stand up, that you'll never act, is at peace because it doesn't need to adjust itself. But when people do rise up and they stand up, even when they're quashed, and I talk about this quite a bit, the system has to rethink itself. And as it's rethinking itself, others are seeing possibility. And that's one of the reasons why, at the end of the day, we are able to be here because of those who preceded us, who acted. And many of them did not, when they passed, know that their actions matter. But they did know that their commitments did. And that's one of the things we need to understand and focus on, the true meaning of political commitment. Because I could tell you also just, you all have known me for many years. And one of the things you know about me for many years is I've done a lot of things that people told me would fail and would never work. But I didn't know if they would. But it's not I who did it. You see what I'm saying? Because I entered in a community of people who were doing it. What the hell would Lewis Gordon have been if there were no Radical Philosophy Association or Sophia or people who are doing stuff, everything from the Black Panther Party to the Communist Party to the variety of groups. And a lot of people don't understand that point that was said earlier about communism because, it's a lot like the dirty word thing, but a lot of people don't understand the complex question of what it is for the global empowerment of people. In other words, it's a democratic notion. But the point at the end of the day is for those of us who can recognize problems, not to look to the side waiting for other people to act, but for us to do our part and to remember with humility that we're not gods. We're human beings working together, and we must create institutions just like this forum in which we're speaking right now. That's an institution through which people could have access to ideas and to think about their actions, and also to understand that things can be built from people working together. So yeah, thank you, Bob. Thank you. Yeah, I see Karsten and it's
Now we've heard
Fred.
from several philosophers.
Fred.
Let's go to a sociologist.
Hi, Fred.
Fred Pincus.
Yes. As a sociologist, it's always informative to see how philosophers approach things. And thank you much. I'm also Jewish and a member of a progressive secular Jewish organization in Baltimore. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how your Jewishness has influenced your writings and your works.
Thank you for that question. Well, one of the first things I should mention is, and Bob and Cliff and Karsten and Richard, a lot of them know this about me, which was in the 90s when I was writing, I didn't call myself a philosopher. I called myself a radical theorist because I took the position that there are more important questions to ask than philosophical ones. They include philosophical ones, but I didn't want to limit myself to them. And that's why my writings are read in sociology, anthropology, psychology, many disciplines, and political science, many disciplines. And I'm never insulted by that. I celebrate that because you could see my transdisciplinary commitments are there. So I actually always am also a philosopher. But I'll tell you a story that connects the Jewish part. When I wrote my books in the 90s, being a Jew wasn't on my mind. Only one time in one of the books, being a Jew was on my mind. And that was when I was writing Fanon and the Crisis of European Man, because I presented 2 chapters of it at the Institute for Human Sciences in Prague. And as you know, that was one of the few places Husserl could go as a Jew to present. So although I'm also a Black man, I went to Prague as a Jew. And it was a rather striking situation because there were some people in the streets who were also racist, yelling Svatsa, right? And, but at the same time, there were also people who were hiding being Jews, and they saw this young Black Jewish guy publicly speak as a Jew. And that brought them out of the woodwork to think through what it is to take on that responsibility. But beyond that, I didn't think that bad faith and anti-Black racism or in some of my other writings at that time were from the perspective of being a Jew. But then I read an essay by a rabbi. In the early 2000s, a rabbi by the name of Walter Isaac wrote an essay on the question of Afro-Jewish studies. And in the essay, he said that all of Lewis Gordon's writings should be included in contemporary Afro-Jewish studies research. And I thought, huh? So I went back and reread my own work. And I was shocked at how Jewish the writings were. He was totally correct. For instance, every Lewis Gordon essay or writing is an attack on idolatry. Okay? One of the fundamental things about being a Jew is to reject idolatry and to take on the ethical responsibility, all right, for the possibility of tikkun olam. Okay? So the very idea that we're supposed to be open, an open dialectic, not a closed notion of dialectics, the open conception of the ethical, the idea that it's fundamentally about community. I began to realize that so much of my thought was actually Jewish. Now, the other thing a lot of people don't know about Jewish thought is because a lot of Jews only know they're Jews. And a lot of the work I've done with Jewish studies and so forth, I work with 150 Jewish organizations across the globe. I know, when I meet many Jews, most Jews could only talk about Ashkenazi or Sephardi. They don't know about Koshin. They don't know about the varieties of Beta Israel. They don't know about Kaifeng Jews. They don't know about Lemba Jews. That I could just keep going, okay? And in the midst of this, what they don't know also is that the ancient world had no reason to use the contemporary geopolitical maps. Africa in the ancient world continued all the way to the Indus Valley. Asia in the ancient world continued all the way into East Africa. You see where I'm going with this? And so it's no accident that if you look at a lot of ancient East African languages and thought, you could see a lot of the foundations of what we call Judaism. And because I could read some of those languages, I was shocked, because at first I was saying, why am I seeing terms that later emerge in Hebrew, in Medu Neter? And I began to realize that part of the the way humanity is separated is to treat us as if we're these silos of language, when in fact, ancient humanity was always communicating with each other. That's, as I said, there were always Africans in what we call, in fact, one of the funny things is, I also looked through paleoanthropology. And if you look at even the question of when human beings became lighter, so to speak, that's very recent. It's connected with agriculture, and it only goes back 6,000 to 8,000 years. That means almost everybody, including those cave paintings we look at, were people of my hue or darker. But they had no reference point to call themselves black or white or anything like that. And so if we come back to the question of Judaism, there are people, even though my background is technically Orthodox, all right, because I'm from Mizrahi and Sephardic populations. We didn't have to go around yelling, we're Jews, the Jews all over the place. So we had a living Judaism. Our Judaism and our Africanism were one. It was about the affirmation of life. And I think there are times when, among my fellow Jews, we forget that ultimately Judaism is about community and life. We get in trouble. And there is a real clue, especially because, I was not at all in like the religious camp, though I was designated Orthodox. It was just that as I began to study and learn more, in fact, as a child, and even into my 30s, I was very critical of rabbinic Judaism. But one of the things that changed me around this issue was actually when I began to look at rabbinic Judaism's view on rituals of death. Because a lot of people don't know this, but in many Jewish communities, death was a lavish affair. It was expensive. And there was a lot of money being spent to the point where people who couldn't afford it would just leave the body of their loved one in the streets. And rabbis got together and argued against that and said it lacked dignity. So henceforth, a plain wooden box, it should be modest, and we should go through the rituals in which we let go of the individual's life as being linked to mitzvot. I'm using technical Jewish terms here, but the short version of it, for me, that was really moving and inspiring. It connected to what animates me also as a radical political humanist. And so I actually see my Judaism, my Africanism, and my commitment to humanistic revolutionary struggles as one. It's about ultimately the affirmation of life and dignity and respect for our fellow human being.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. The last question comes from Carson Struhl.
Thank you. Wow, this is great. This is great discussion. It's wonderful to see you, Cliff and Bob. Richard, I saw you yesterday. And I appreciated, Fred, your question. I want to sort of continue that with first a very brief comment and then leading to the question. The brief comment is that racialization has never been just about color. Nazi Germany did not identify Jews by color, but they were a race. They racialized them. So that's very clear. But the other part of that is that there's a whole literature on how Jews and Irish became white in the United States. They were not always white. Jews were at least off-white, and sometimes and Irish were often considered black. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, given that's part of your multiple identities. And maybe just one other comment. I'll have one thought, which is that American society makes a kind of contract and says, okay, we're going to move you from this side of the line to another side of the line if you will other those other people.
Yeah, well, there are several things. What some people in the United States don't realize, for instance, is how much Nazi Germany was inspired by the United States.
Mhm.
Its eugenicist policies, apartheid South Africa, they were just saying they were trying to be the United States.
Mhm.
And so that's part of this issue. But what we have to ask, what is this history in the United States? Well, part of this history in the United States was, and I talk about this in the book, but I talk about it elsewhere too. The United States is a kind of factory of racialization,
Mhm.
all right? And a factory of, there's so many groups who were not white before. Greeks are an example. And a lot of people don't know the history there. I gave a lecture for the Hellenic Museum in Chicago, where they explained that the Klan used to be lynching Greeks. And Greek women met with the Klan and they said, what are we going to do to stop you from doing this? And they say, become white. And they're like, well, how do we become white? They're like, come on our side, attack the blacks, do the this, do the that. And it began, and certain Greek civic organizations emerged that were anti-black organizations to get American membership. And this happened also with other groups. This happened with Irish in Harlem, et cetera. But there's something more complicated when we get with Jews. And that is because you see, when I look at the history of Jews in the what we call the Americas, right now, Cliff and others are in Abya Yala, a certain part of that's an indigenous name for that part of the Americas. But there was an awareness of Jews as being morphologically diverse. The first Jew who was arrested in the colonies was a man by the name of Solomon. He was arrested in New Hampshire, believe it or not. And he was arrested for working on the Sabbath, which for Christians was Sunday. And he was arrested and he was put in the records as a mulatto, right? And he explained that his Sabbath was on a Friday into Saturday. He was a Jew. And in fact, Blassingame and many other scholars in the history of Jews in the colonies would explain that there used to be shuls or temples and Jewish communities who would greet slave ships with ransom money because they would look for who among the enslaved were Jews and purchase and manumit them. So that means there was an actual historical awareness of what in today's language is the multiraciality, but in their language, the morphological diversity of Jewish peoples. And this made sense because you see 30% of enslaved Africans were Muslim. And as you know, wherever there were Muslims, there were Jews along the trade routes, etc. But the thing is, you see, internal to their communities in Africa or parts of Europe or parts of Asia, their internal communities know who the Jews were versus everybody else. But an external community wouldn't know the difference. And so there's a whole story of Jewish history to be told. But the complicated thing is the lore of whiteness, because once whiteness as a mark of full citizenship was happening in the colonies, and not just the United States, in Canada, in Australia, New Zealand, quite a few other places. South Africa was one, of course. But then a debate actually emerged among Jews. There were Jews who wanted full membership. And so what was at the time morphologically diverse Jewish communities increasingly became segregated and separated. And what began to happen is that certain groups of Jews, and I know the history of it because I'm also a professor of Jewish studies, of Jewish people, and I look into this history. In the United States, as an example, the separated African Americans who were Jews increasingly began to develop a unique African American Judaism. And that's a whole other story. But in the Caribbean, there were similar things. And it's really, really funny because when you meet these Jewish communities, I remember a good example when my wife, Jane, who is from Ashkenazi Jews whose background go to Belarus and Ukraine, When she met my relatives in Jamaica, my uncle looked at my mother and looked at my wife and said to my mother about my wife, is she really a Jewess? Because for him, Jews look like me and him and others. But in that moment, my wife actually liked that moment because it destabilized white normativity. Because the Jews she's from, and I've seen this all over the place, including Jews I grew up with in New York, including Shoah survivors or Holocaust survivors, for those who are not familiar with it, did not define themselves as white. A lot of the recent whiteness that among Jews comes out of neoconservatism and an effort to try to link Jewishness to whiteness in such a way that there are even neoconservative Jews who argue that being critical of white supremacy is anti-Semitic, which is absurd. So yes, if we come back to that question, we need right now, just as I talk about a more enriched way to talk about Blackness and Black studies, and I do this in Jewish studies, we need to have more enriched ways to talk about who Jewish people are in Jewish history. And I'm part of a group, several groups. One is Bechol Lashon in San Francisco, but another one is the American Jewish Historical Society, where we're organizing in New Orleans a beginning. It's not going to be perfect, but a beginning of this conversation. And there's also an Afro-Jewish Studies Association that brings up these issues. And it becomes really funny because there are a lot of Jews in the organization now because they're around so many Black Jews. What's funny is they're legally designated white, but if you
Okay,
look at them,
Betsy,
if you look at them, you can't distinguish them from some of the Black Jews, even though they're legally designated white.
I just want to mention, to sort of reinforce the divisions historically among Jews. When my mother first met my father, her parents were extremely unhappy because they were Galiziano and my father was Litfox. And Galiziano does not marry a Litfox. Fortunately, he was in medical school and was going to become a doctor, so that trumped the Litfox.
Well,
Thank you.
I
Great.
think
Thank you.
we've used our time, and we need to wrap this up. I want to give thanks to Lewis Gordon for generating a very provocative discussion. And today's webinar, I should point out, as well as our past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. I hope you will all join us next Monday for what will be the first of a series of programs celebrating Women's History Month. We'll lead the month off with a talk by Sylvia Federici, celebrating women's struggles. That's next Monday at 1 o'clock Central Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Time. But now I want to close out Black History Month with the Black National Anthem, which is a very moving song that I hope we will all enjoy and contemplate as we listen to its words.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of piercing skies, let it resound, let it resounding sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, lives in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place, come to our Father's side. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star stands. God of our weary ears, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from what God where we met these hearts drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
That was truly amazing.
Yeah.
That
Can
was
I make,
beautiful.
can I make this one comment?
That's such a,
Before-
such a moving song because it sums up the spirit of the history of a people in struggle against oppression.
Somebody said that we don't know what the outcome will be of our struggle, and I made this comment in the chat that the outcome of my actions has always been the joy of having done them. That the glory of struggling toward our aims is what keeps me thrilled
Everything you're doing
about
to find out about this new simple 30-second bedtime ritual that can potentially eliminate type 2 diabetes.
Oh,
If you
Sorry
have
I don't know
about
what
type 2
that is.
diabetes or pre-diabetes, then
sorry
listen
about
closely.
that.
Research from
Maybe,
several prominent universities have
Um,
demonstrated that this simple bedtime
maybe you could look at the chat and see what I wrote. Anyway,
I'm
death-
sorry.
death is death, and that's okay, because I've done those many acts we need to do to attain our daily glory. Feels good every time we write something, we stand, we march, organize. Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to close by thanking our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamond, Bob Stone, Olivia Canales, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off. Thank you. Hope to see you again next Monday.
To all of
Hi,
you.
Harry. Good to see you. And Louis, thank you. This was terrific.
Thank you, Karsten.